Good? Okay. I'm going to call this public hearing to order at 5:32. If we could all please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, we need to do a roll call for the Barnstead board.
Jason Henry.
Matt Jizokis.
Eunice Landry.
Tim Broderick.
Lila Adkins. Okay. I'm going to open the public hearing pursuant to RSA 194D, and we're going to start with some comments from Superintendent Broderick.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So there's a handout on the table over here, but also on all the chairs already. And the first one is a slides presentation printed to a page. This material has been available online for a few weeks, and some of it is repetitive from both the Alton deliberative session and the public hearing held in this room 1 week ago tonight for Alton's public hearing on its or their warrant question on the same topic. It's all the same information. So if you've seen any of that, you've seen these same things. I don't plan to go through this slide by slide because at this point we've done it a few times, and some folks by now are becoming familiar with it. And if you're not, you can familiarize yourself with it without it being read to you, I would imagine. But as we've discussed here at the joint board level for the last few years, high schools that experience significant declines in enrollment struggle in really a circular way, meaning just that it feeds on itself. So I'm on the second page of this handout myself right now. And if you've lived in the area for long, you've seen this happen, probably at some other schools in the area. If you've been paying attention, it becomes harder to field athletic teams. Even here at Prospect, it's become harder to field both a JV and a varsity team in certain sports, and as that happens, program quality deteriorates. I didn't mean to lead with athletics. It's just the first thing here. It's probably arguably not the most important thing, but it's one of the factors that contributes to the perceived quality of a public school in a community. It's harder to offer honors courses, for example, but really that goes for any of a wide range of course offerings with declining enrollment. And this school has experienced this. There are times that students will put in their course requests, and then after they've been processed, there might be 3 or 4 students who want to take a class, and that puts the administration in a tough spot. Do we devote resources to running a class for 3 students? Do we simply not run it at all? And if we don't run it at all, that deprives students of that opportunity. That goes for academic electives of all kinds, not just core academic subjects and honors classes. And then the same is true of extracurricular activities. All of this yields increasing per pupil costs without budget cuts. So a school that has, it's really simple math. If budgets stay the same or rise, and the number of students the budget is being divided by decreases, per pupil cost increases. The Department of Education, not only in New Hampshire but in every state, publishes annually reports on per pupil costs for all schools, and also provides an average. As somebody who's been attending budget committee meetings in many communities for a number of years now, I can tell you that per pupil cost is one of the things that people outside of our schools tend to look at when wondering if what the school is doing, what the school board is budgeting or requesting in a budget, is reasonable. So as per pupil costs increase, there tends to be more pressure from communities on school budgets. This goes back to the beginning, because now we're looking at school boards having to talk about or think about cutting things that then yield fewer opportunities in athletics and extracurriculars and honors classes and other electives. So the whole thing spirals, and as a community, may begin to perceive more cuts and later lower quality, there may be more flight away from a public school. So I want to emphasize, this is the reason the joint board, more than 4 years ago, long before we met, had already identified this as one of their biggest concerns in this school system. I happen to think they were right, but that's immaterial. I've been working on this because they asked me to. The projection that we've made for enrollment at this school over the next 6 or 7 years is that we should level out a little bit year after next, but we're talking about an average of maybe 370 students. And on that chart that I'm referring to, you see green bars and red bars. So the green bars are our prediction, and the red bars are what's actually happened. So we're running a little bit lower in enrollment than we predicted the last couple of years. That's not really long enough to identify a trend and make a prediction, but if we continue to run below prediction, then those 5 years, starting in 2024-25, could be closer to 350, 355, 360. So what has the joint board been doing about this? Again, they started before I met them. At a minimum, since the 2018-19 year, the year before we met, they had started talking with the school board from Gilmanton, because Gilmanton, which is in an area agreement with Guilford, had that agreement expiring. Area agreements in New Hampshire generally run for 20-year terms, and Guilford and Gilmanton were approaching the end of one. So this joint board, during my first year here, successfully negotiated a tuition agreement with the Gilmanton School Board, which then chose not to present it to the voters on the March warrant in Gilmanton. Instead, they ran a warrant article asking the voters in Gilmanton if they would renew the area agreement with Guilford, which they did. Under New Hampshire law, 2 school boards can enter into an exclusive tuition agreement anytime they want. That authority is reserved for school boards. So that does not require a vote, even though a lot of communities will take one out of an interest in transparency, I think, more than anything. A year later or so, this joint board identified a subcommittee to work with a subcommittee of the Milton School Board, started negotiating, again, an exclusive tuition agreement with them, and Milton abandoned that negotiation without responding to the first proposal that was made by this board. So we just never got a counter proposal. The board, through its own work and through mine, has attempted to engage in conversations, some of which might surprise you. We responded to a letter from Deerfield, of all places, which might seem a little far away, but they asked, and I responded on behalf of the board that I'm sure this board would be happy to talk. Deerfield is going in its own direction now and having its own discussion about options over there. We responded to a request from the Pittsfield School Board, which 2 or 3 years ago established a committee to explore its options. We sent our response and didn't hear back. I've had subsequent conversations with their superintendent, but nothing between the boards. The authority to talk about a tuition agreement is reserved for these school boards. They have to establish a group to do that formally. That hasn't happened there. I've had, I would call them casual conversations with town officials and district officials in a few other communities in the area, but none of them have resulted in boards approaching boards to have a formal negotiation process. The concept of open enrollment is actually not unique, although it may feel like it here right now. The majority of states in the US have some kind of public school choice that allows students to apply to attend a school other than the one in the community where they live. So we are the exception rather than the norm in New Hampshire by not having that. There are ways for New Hampshire students to attend school outside of their districts of residence, but they require, again, exclusive agreements or case-by-case agreements between school boards. There's no system in the state, except there is this law. So I am now, if you're following along on the page that begins with New Hampshire does have RSA 194D open enrollment at the top. We have this law. It was passed in 2009, and as far as I've been able to determine, one district has adopted the provisions of RSA 194D in New Hampshire, and they have not, according to their superintendent, accepted any students to attend any of their schools under this law, which means it's untested. It is very clear that a school district's legislative body can adopt the terms of this law and thereby permit the school board to operate one or more of its schools as an open enrollment school. So here the legislative body of Prospect Mountain High School is actually both the voters of Alton and the voters of Barnstead, and that's because of the joint maintenance agreement that exists between the two towns, the two school boards, to operate this school. So the legislative body is actually two, and it's these two upcoming elections. It's also clear in the law that an open enrollment school may charge the district where a student attending from outside of its catchment area 80% of its per pupil cost, but the law also contradicts itself, which is wonderful, and establishes that the school board can always charge less if they choose to. So in one paragraph it reads not less than 80%, and in another paragraph it actually reads or less than, if the board chooses to do so. There's also, based on a technical advisory we received last April from the Department of Education's attorney, it has been made clear, at least through that, and there are copies on the table over here if anyone's interested, that the payment of that tuition is not by mutual agreement. It's established by law that the open enrollment school is entitled to collect that tuition. There are some things that are not as clear in the law. It is unclear if other districts also have to adopt the provisions of the law in order for their students to be able to attend an open enrollment school. There is some implication that that's not the case, and I think that technical advisory from last April addresses this a little bit. But at the same time, because it hasn't been done, nobody really knows. The State Board of Education, according to the law, does have the authority to write rules and issue guidance around how this law is to be applied between school districts, but so far they haven't had a reason to do so because nobody's done it. So on the topic of 80% of tuition, I'm actually going to skip over it until we get to the FAQs, but I think that the concept of sunk costs is very important to understand. After a number of attempts to explain this, somebody told me maybe we should try talking about hailing a taxi cab when you land at the airport, if you've ever flown, and when you hail a taxi cab and you're alone, and you're going to pay $20 to get to your hotel. If you have two people with you and the three of you get in the same cab, it's going to cost $20 to get to the hotel. So you can divide that cost among three people, or you can pay it all by yourself, but it will never cost $60 for three people to ride in that cab. If the cab fare is $20, then that's what it will be. I hope that helps, because that's another attempt. I've talked about lights and heat and how the building's already warm and already lighted, but it has proven to be a little bit challenging to talk about the concept of sunk cost. We'll get back to it, I'm sure. There's a number of students who could attend this school, and this is still continuing, I guess, on the topic of sunk cost. There's a number of students who could attend this school that wouldn't really cost almost anything, would cost a little. We issue Chromebooks. We're a one-to-one school that issues Chromebooks, so there's a cost there, but that's less than $500 per student. If we went from only being able to field varsity teams in certain sports to being able to field varsity and JV teams, okay, there might be some uniforms there, but it's hard to imagine the additional cost adding up to very much at all. Now, if a school thought this is a way to double our enrollment and bring in 300 or 400 kids, okay, Well, that would certainly add cost, but that's not been the board's intentions, talking about this. In this case, the board has been talking about things like, we have an average class size, for example, in mathematics of about 13 students. So imagine there are 7 or 8 sections in that core academic subject for the freshman class. And let's say 3 more students or 4 more students joined each of those classes. Now we would have 16 or 17 students on average, right? One of them might have 22, one of them still might have 13, but on average, we get up to 16 or 17 students per class, and you're talking about 3 or 4 students times 7 or 8 sections. So my kind of math is to call that about 30, more or less. Could be 28, could be 32, but it's somewhere in there. And those are seats that currently sit in this building empty. There's already a teacher in the room. There's already curriculum in place. The lights are on, and the heat is heating. So that has been sort of the spirit and the nature of the joint board's conversations about this possibility. There is also here, and it's in your hands if you're at a chair because we placed them there, but there are other copies over here, an FAQ document. This has also been online for about a week that addresses what seem to have been the top 10 most popular questions about this. And again, without reading all of them to you, the first one I think I answered already this evening. Why has the joint board been looking at this? What other options has the joint board explored? I've talked about that this evening. Would there be admissions criteria? That's a good question. So here's a sample of an admissions policy, the type of which could be adopted by the joint board under this law. The board, after the legislative bodies adopt the provisions of this law, then the board would adopt an admissions process, which would be sent to the State Board of Education for their approval. This is modeled on one that exists in New Hampshire. There's admissions for other reasons, even though there aren't any 194D open enrollment schools. In New Hampshire, there are schools that take in a significant number of students by application and collect tuition, and this is modeled on one of those. It's also blended a little bit with an admissions criteria that one of my former schools used, because we were a school of choice that took all of our students by application, and a public school. All public schools I'm talking about tonight. So the law allows, for example, the educational needs of the student applying to be considered, and that can include any special programs that exist at the open enrollment school. So for example, this school has an honors diploma program. About 30 to 33% of our students every year earn an honors diploma. A student who is particularly interested in that program could get additional credit or points in the application process for having that interest. I think by the time we're done this spring, there will be an engineering robotics pathway diploma available to Prospect Mountain students starting next fall. Therefore, that would be another example of something that if a student applying it says that they're particularly interested in, that could result in some points, because this essentially becomes a rubric and amounts to points being given to each application. The applicant's prior commitment to education is one of the other categories, and that can be demonstrated in a number of ways that could include, but not be limited to, grades. We could look at attendance. We could solicit recommendations from school counselors or teachers. Behavioral records can be considered. And then, of course, space availability. And that's a big piece, because every year the joint board would decide how many seats are available. And if the idea is to fill seats that are otherwise empty, as opposed to expanding and adding a bunch of cost, then it would be an important conversation every year. So for now, in a rough math kind of a way, it seems like about 30 students in each graduating class might not add a lot of cost to this school. And certainly the marginal cost would be more than covered by the tuition that the school could collect. So that's sort of hopefully that helps answer the question about admissions. Limiting the number of students, I think that's been addressed already tonight and previously. Could it be ended? If this happens, could it be stopped? And the answer is yes. The joint board in any year could vote not to make any seats available, and then they could just decide not to do it anymore. There could also be a warrant article petitioned or submitted by the joint board to stop operating under the provisions of this law at any time. That would have to happen in both towns, but there are a couple of different ways that the board or the citizens could decide not to do this anymore. The only caveat that's important to understand is that any student who has been admitted at that point should be allowed to stay until they graduate. So that could take a few years. There have been some questions about students with complex special learning needs. There's also here, these aren't our numbers, but this is a sample, again, from another district, just so that folks can see that this exists, is that in New Hampshire, when a student is attending a school outside of their district of residence, their tuition is based on the operating cost of the school, which is the average for services for all students. More complex special needs are different and are billed back to the communities where students reside. So if there is any concern about those kinds of costs ending up in the mix for Alton and Barnstead taxpayers, there's a mechanism for making sure that that is not the case. Because of that, a representative of the school district in the community where the student resides becomes a member of the IEP development team here or in any other open enrollment school. We're not sure about the answer to the question about vocational programs. I think it's important, certainly to the joint board and probably to the voters in these two towns, that the number of spaces available at Lakes Region Technology Center for students who reside in Alton and Barnstead not be reduced because of something like this. So I've reached out to the Department of Education. Nobody's ever asked them this question before because this hasn't been done before. So we're having a conversation to try to get a better answer to that. It does seem like a detail that may not emerge or might be a while before it does. But clearly I understand, and I think the board does, that the concern of the communities would be, because as of right now, and anyone who doesn't know should understand this, the number of spaces we have available at LRTC, those seats are filled every year by students from Alton and Barnstead, and we have more students who would go if they could. So it's not as if we have an excess capacity over there. So one of the possibilities is that students can go to the vocational center that serves the community where they reside. Again, waiting for some more feedback from the Department of Ed. Another possibility is that we might be able to try to expand our capacity at LRTC. I've had some questions about the prospect of moving the middle schools from ACS and Barnstead Elementary here instead of trying something like this. There are a number of reasons. I don't want to say it's a terrible idea because the joint board may end up having to consider it at some point, depending on how this and other things go. But I think there are some good reasons to leave it for later and try other things first. For one thing, it moves money around, but it doesn't necessarily create much efficiency, maybe a little. But the bigger reasons are that while Barnstead has a school crowding issue, Alton does not. And it's interesting to me as a relative newcomer here, I've heard a lot of talk in the Alton community about perceptions of sort of a troubled history with that building. I don't know what they've done in the last 5 years or so, but when I walk around that place, it looks great. And I know there's enough capacity because I have the numbers of average class sizes and the number of rooms and the amount of space. So I don't think that there's a mutual incentive. I don't think it would benefit both communities the same way, and therefore there may not be that kind of support across both communities for moving their middle schools into this high school. Beyond that, most successful middle high schools have a distinct separate space for their 7th and 8th graders, or whatever middle school grades they're serving, which we would not have here. At best, it might be a hallway, but even so, because of the layout of science labs and things, it would be much more mixed in than you would normally want something like that to be. So I'm going to drop that for now, unless there are other questions or this conversation. There's a line at the end of the warrant article about 0% of Alton or Barnstead students being allowed to leave the district. And some folks have asked what that means, and it's a really good question. And it's one of the areas, there are actually copies of the law over here as well. So if you want to find all of the places where it's unclear or it contradicts itself, please take a copy, because it does it really well in a few ways. And this is one of those areas where it's just not that clear what the law is getting at, what the intention was of RSA 194D when it was adopted. Some of these things are clear that I've already talked about. This is not. So I talked to our attorney, and our best guess, you know, in some districts, they're large enough to have more than one school within the same district that serves the same grade levels. Like Manchester, for example, they have 3 high schools in Manchester. So it seemed like maybe this is about, if they became an open enrollment school district, it would be so that students can apply to go to different high schools within that district, and maybe this would set a cap. That's a guess, and the only reason we're guessing is because, again, we have this advisory from the Department of Ed's attorney that seems to tell us that any student in New Hampshire can attend an open enrollment school that adopts the provisions of this law. And if that's the case, then they wouldn't need our permission. So it's a question, and I think until somebody weighs in, perhaps the state board, there isn't going to be a solid answer. And then the last question, I think I've already talked about sunk cost enough for now, 80% versus some other percent, and what that means. I think the important thing that I probably haven't mentioned, and I'll be done for now, or for tonight, to understand is that once revenue has been collected by this district and there isn't new cost associated with it, that excess revenue becomes unencumbered surplus in the general fund, and at the end of the fiscal year, it gets returned to the communities. The effect being that it reduces the need for property taxation. So one of the end results, and I want to be careful, this isn't the whole point, because I talked first about breadth of academic programs, quality of athletics and extracurriculars, all of the things that it takes to continue to have an excellent school. Those are really the primary concerns here, but keeping funding is the game, right? In order to have all those things, keeping funding is the vehicle for having all those things, and being able to return money to the taxpayers of Alton and Barnstead to lower property taxes is a strategy for being able to do that. To protect a school that even at its current relatively small size still has a woodworking shop and a welding shop and 2 fine arts studios, that has a family and consumer science program, that has a separate business program, that has all of these things that as schools get smaller and smaller are typically the things first to go when boards have to make difficult decisions that they don't enjoy making. I'm done.
Well, I was saying, and we've made 2 difficult decisions. We have actually reduced staffing because of some of the shrinking enrollment, correct? And I was probably going to be asked, who's in charge of paying for transportation?
So, yeah, thank you, Mr. Henry. So, under this law, a student who resides in New Hampshire can apply to attend an open enrollment school, provided they can provide their own transportation. So there's no transportation obligation by this district for students who reside outside of Alton and Barnstead.
Okay. I'm going to open the floor for public comment and questions. And if you have anything to say, if you just state your name for the record, please.
Something was said, we can't hear out here.
If you have questions, now's the time.
Now's the time. I don't think the mics are working or the sound system is working, but we open now?
Yes.
Excellent. Tim Conrad from Barnstead Parade. Can you hear me? Yes. Ah, good. I get so many questions, and everything that you've said, Mr. Superintendent, is ingrained in my brain right at the moment, but it's going to be difficult. If I'm wrong, let me know. Prospect Mountain's a great school. You know, this is super. It is surrounded, however, by sending districts, not by receiving districts. Beyond that, you get into a distance problem, which is why I wonder why Deerfield even approached you. I mean, that's totally ridiculous, totally ridiculous. Are you, as superintendent, who has talked with other superintendents, because that's what superintendents do, are you aware of other contracts between sending and receiving districts? And how are they are set up, and what penalties would be incurred by the sending district were they to pull students out? What it would take to dissolve a contract? I know it's probably 2 to 3 years. Okay, maybe you can tell me, a little more clearly. And basically what I'm wondering is, I have no problem with calling us an open enrollment school. That's great. Who's going to come?
Okay. So I have developed a little bit of expertise, but only a little in this area in the last few years. So it does depend on the type of agreement that other districts are already in. There are some districts, school districts in New Hampshire that have made the decision to have pre-K or K through 8 schools and not run a high school. And they pay tuition in some cases. In fact, hello Barnstead Board, you were one of these prior to the construction of this building. They pay tuition in some cases to many. 13, more than a dozen other school districts. And that's not necessarily by agreement, because those towns, those school districts have told their children or their citizens, go wherever you can get in. Typically, they also have a school of record, which everybody can go to, and that would require an agreement. These agreements are private. So what I'm talking about is a tuition agreement between 2 municipal entities, 2 school districts. And their terms, you kind of have to read each one. An area agreement is a different thing. That's what Gilmanton has with Guilford. I'm not an expert on how one might not participate in one, but it's also possible that the Board of Education would take the view that a single child or a few single children choosing not to participate in that would be more like children choosing to be homeschooled and maybe irrelevant. But that's a theory, not an assertion on my part. I don't know. I also have spent some time talking with a town, and I'm not going to identify them for reasons that I think will be really obvious, that is a member of a regional school district right now. The process for leaving a regional school district in New Hampshire is prescribed by law and does take a few years, which might be what the gentleman asking the question was referring to. And it's a big ask for those communities, probably an unreasonable one for most, because the end of that road ends with a warrant article asking that, in most cases, that community's voters to float a bond to buy their own school back from their regional district. And that seems like it's probably not likely to be a popular thing. However, and this is very important, what I believe actually might happen here is that this process brings districts together, meaning other districts and this board, other school boards and this board, to talk about direct agreements, rather than go by the terms of this law or the rules that may be made and clarified by the State Board of Education in the coming 6 or 12 or 18 months. Maybe another school district would say, let's just have a conversation. And then, because 2 boards in New Hampshire can work out an agreement anytime they want. So it's difficult for me to predict exactly where this road will lead. There are a lot of possibilities, but I've yet to perceive any downside risk for Alton and Barnstead to adopting the provisions of this law and saying we're at least willing to be an open enrollment school. Where does it go from there? Are there 20 or 30 kids who don't reside in Alton and Barnstead attending this school next September? I don't know, but there's only one way to find out.
You ask who might attend. I ref a lot and coach a lot around the area, and there are multiple towns their children are close enough to us that they want to come here or ready to apply now, who I've spoken to directly. This school does have a very good reputation about its academics, so they want to come here. And we have beautiful campus and field stuff that some of them that actually sign agreements are actually closer to this end than another end, most likely to get here a little sooner. So I know right away there are people who are ready to do applications. How many, I don't know, but I've talked to at least a handful or so saying that there's more behind them.
There's some information over here on some display boards, and there may be in some local papers an op-ed that I submitted last week, running later this week, that cite some of this data. If you look at this, including this one, the six public high schools geographically closest to right here, this school has the highest four-year graduation rate in that group, has the lowest dropout rate in that group, and this is going back over the last 5 years, not just 1 year, year after year after year. The second highest ELA and math SAT scores among juniors in high school who take the SAT. And what that tells me, along with things like a very high rate of participation in extracurriculars, which we have, an extraordinarily strong student culture that has been fostered and developed by a principal who's been here for a long time, by extremely dedicated faculty and staff who understand that it's a personal relationship with each student that really builds that culture. My point is, I think all of those data points suggest that there might be students residing in some nearby communities who would see this as a good option.
Well, I think you're being very realistic about it. I think my question, I'll pin you down, I'll get a little more close to what I'm trying to get to. Of the contracts that have been signed with the contiguous sending schools, are you aware of any sending school that has demonstrated being unhappy with their receiving school?
I don't think so.
Or is that difficult to put out
that's tough to
publicly?
answer. I think there may be as many answers to that question as there are citizens.
we can drop the question. No, I hear you. I guess.
Look, this isn't about trying to break up somebody else's.
No, not at all. Not at all. What I'm trying to get to is with the contracts that are signed between senders and receivers, do these contracts have within their writings anything which allows a certain number of the sending students to go to other schools?
I don't know.
Or is it totally exclusive?
It depends on the agreement.
I don't know whether you know that.
Nope. I only know what our draft agreements with some of these other communities included, but I don't,
Because, if one of these receiving schools said, we're going to have an exclusive, except you can send 15 of your students elsewhere, that's $150,000 to $200,000. I can't imagine they would write that into the contract.
Of all the tuition agreements that Barnstead had with all the receiving schools we used, there was no language in those contracts.
Okay. Yeah, I know I was part of that.
I know.
I ran the bus service.
So I'm familiar with one nearby community, and I'm using the term nearby a little bit loosely, but you got to.
Well, we can just write you're being evasive. That's okay. I understand.
Trying to be polite to our neighbors and friends. I'm familiar with one nearby community that has an agreement that states that 90% of their students go to a particular high school and 10% can attend another one. How they determine that breakdown is their business, but I know of at least one example where that exists.
Well, that's what I was looking for, whether there was anything, or because that would pin down what I'm saying about how are you going to get a few students if they have exclusive agreements. It's going to be difficult. And also, as far as I know, which is not that much, the sending students from around here, no, I mean that from not being on the board or anything like that. Last time I was on a school board was many years ago. I lost my train of thought. That's okay.
Stand up, sit back down.
There are at least 7 towns around here, which could be potential. That includes Chichester, Epsom, they're farther away. And that again goes with my point of thinking that the farther away, the less, no matter how nice the campus is, or how many tennis courts you have, or where, you know, whether you send your kids to Wolfboro or Laconia, it's the distance, they won't get voted in. So, anyway, I was just interesting, since in here it said that you did get into or negotiate a tuition agreement with the Gilmanton School Board, which eventually chose not to enter that agreement. Were there any other exclusive attempts that you made?
Milton.
New Durham?
Milton. No, New Durham's a member of the Governor Wentworth District.
Okay. What was the other one you just?
This board negotiated with Milton a couple of years ago. They operate Newt High School.
But I will add that you sent letters around, you can tell me.
Oh yeah, I mean, we've had conversations with probably half a dozen total.
So the letters were sent around to a bunch of surrounding schools asking if they were interested as well. So when we were doing that, so we did spread the word and ask other school districts as well.
Right. I mean, it's nice to have the room, and I certainly hate to see all those open slots going on for the next 20 years, or we could do something else with them if this doesn't work out. But I'm totally in favor of what you're proposing, and I don't want to put a dark cloud over it. But show me some encouragement as to why other districts would want to come here when they're. I mean, look at Stratford. You think they'd leave Co-Brown? I don't think so. Not at all. And Gilmanton, and New Durham. Unless they're rumbling somewhere that you as a superintendent are aware of.
Well, and I think, let's see if I can get this to work. This is step one of something that's probably going to take a number of years, as Tim has said. So I think that if this is adopted, this is step one, and then it becomes publicly known that we're open, and then maybe it doesn't become a board-to-board conversation, it becomes, in their community, it becomes a conversation of the public approaching their board and saying, hey, we'd really like choice. And so, if this doesn't pass, then that option is not there.
I don't see anything to be gained if it doesn't pass.
Correct. I agree with you. Yeah.
I see no problem. It's just interesting, history many years ago, a lot of where a person went to high school depended on where they lived in the town. In other words, people that were closer to Stratford would go to Pittsfield. People that were closer to Pittsfield and Loudon would come to Pittsfield. It worked out fine, but that was a different time, a different age, different way of doing things. So, I'm totally in favor of the theory here. I'm just wondering whether there's any optimism at the table of how this will work.
I'm optimistic that it's going to be individuals from different schools, that you're going to have individual parents going to their school board going, we're going over to here because they're an open enrollment.
Okay.
The opinion that we got from the Department of Education is if they go and do that, that district does have to pay. So I think you're going to see, I don't see necessarily a school board trying to enter into an agreement with us. What I see is factions from some of the towns in particular, I know a couple of families in a certain town that they are going to apply to come over here as soon as it's open enrollment. And because some of the friends have already left and moved over this way because they wanted to go to this school, but they're not able to move, they want their children to go here. So they're going to apply immediately and go to that school district and we're sending our kids there.
That would be great to have that option available here.
For us, kids go somewhere else, that's no school become open enrollment. They didn't do that, vote that in kind of like we're doing.
Yeah, but I mean, for us to help people like that would
Oh,
like
yes.
to.
Yep.
Great, wonderful.
Is there any other comment from Barnstead folks? Yes.
What's the point? I know you can hear me.
No, we just need your name.
I don't know who you are, sir.
Yeah, exactly. Rob Ellis, I'm from Barnstead. First time meeting the superintendent. It's kind of odd. Where's our line that we get to and the school's no longer viable as a school? Because it looks like we're about 5% off from the projected last year. So if we kind of spread that out, 340 students in the next couple of years is not out of the realm of possibility. Where is that number? If we choose not to do this, And if we do it, it costs us nothing to do it. Like if we voted in and nobody comes, great, we threw a party, nobody showed up. But if we don't do it, what is that number? I mean, do we just let the tax right up, or at some point in time do we say the school can't be a viable school?
So I don't think that the school board ever says that the school's not a viable school. I don't want to speak for them, but I have a feeling the school board enters into what annually becomes a more and more difficult conversation with budget committees and taxpayers about per pupil costs and program offerings and where our values lie. And when I say our, I mean you, right? The citizens here in these communities. I mean, a small community could choose to have a $40,000 a year per pupil cost in order to have the things it wants to have in its schools. That doesn't exist in New Hampshire right now. But that's really, I think, the answer to your question, Mr. Ellis, is it becomes a difficult conversation year after year after year between property owners, taxpayers, and the school board.
One more. Oh, okay, no, please do. No, I've had my time. You go.
All right, don't fight over it, right?
Megan Schmierman. I have a few questions, and I understand some of these may be logistical that you can't answer at the moment, but just food for thought after hearing all the conversation. First point was made that one district has adopted RSA 194D, but has not been put into practice. Is there any further information available regarding that?
It's Franklin.
Do we know why it was not pursued?
I think, this is only what I think, I don't know firsthand, that there was a student who wanted to attend, I don't know what level, whether it was the high school or some other school, and the community where the student resided said, we don't want to pay. And I think they dropped it.
Actually leads into my next question, which was about tuition costs. If other districts haven't budgeted for this, are we able to put into the application a deadline for tuition payment of some sort? And as far as risk potential, could that result in potential legal action from the other district
Anything's possible.
to fight this law that we're unsure of? If a student chooses to stay to graduate once they've been accepted under open enrollment, but at some point we or the board chooses to pause or end open enrollment, would the sending school still be responsible to pay for their tuition throughout graduation?
I believe so.
Okay. Any consideration at this moment into who would form the committee for application process, knowing that typically student records are under lots of privacy laws and just not, again, I understand it's logistical at the moment, just out
I
of
think this
curiosity.
is why we have guidance departments.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Just one more. Let's hypothesize for a moment, if we can. If there were a school district, and it shall remain nameless, that applied to Prospect Mountain to take all of its students, what would the history of disciplinary problems at that particular, not to be named school have, which would affect the school board's acceptance or non-acceptance of this school?
I think I heard a question for members of the school board, which is if you were entering into negotiations with another school board about an exclusive tuition agreement, say another town was thinking about closing their high school, to what extent might you consider demographics, disciplinary issues at that other school? How much does that enter into your thinking about this? You've been thinking about this for a few years.
I'll speak for myself personally. If you don't know, I run a jail, been working in the jail system for about 29 years. You remove somebody from a system that maybe is not working so well, and sometimes they thrive someplace else. So for me, is their children and the opportunity to go somewhere else, even though they may have had, it's not every single one of them that had issues. Maybe it is a little higher in some other places, but it could be because of lack of funding or lack of a lot of different things. Where the school, to me, here has proven that we make kids successful. So for me, one person only, I say, I'm not that harsh on looking at somebody's discipline stuff. If a whole school wanted to come. Different if I think for open enrollment, where we do it, for me, where we do application and we only have limited seats and those kind of things.
This is all
This is just me personally.
hypothetical. However, let's just say under this hypothesis that an employee of the particular school removed 2 children of hers and sent them to school in Concord because of the discipline problems at the school for which she works. Again, the school shall remain nameless.
I think you have to look at their,
I'm wondering whether you have that option.
I think if you're talking, for me, I think you're talking two things. Open enrollment, you have that option. I think you're entering an agreement to take on a whole school. I don't know what options you have to say I'm only going to take everybody but you two.
Okay.
I don't know.
I guess what I'm thinking is once they've been accepted, basically, it's up to you to educate them. Would that be correct?
Well, the student's conduct here matters. Once a student's been admitted, their privilege of remaining can be subject to conditions.
Okay.
I don't want to speak for the whole board, so I just want to say something.
no, I agree with you. I think you have to look at where they came from and the staff that was provided and the services and the resources that sending community had, is going to be different from what's provided here. And hopefully we're doing a good job with our kids, so.
And if I can just add, I mean, I just want to speak for the culture here in that if there were discipline problems for whatever reason, we have qualified staff here to deal with that. I mean, when we first opened the school in 2004, 5, we were worried about the 2 towns meshing. This is Prospect Mountain. It's not Alton students, and it's not Barnstead students. And this school has developed that culture. We accept students. We work with students here.
I went to a regional school up north, we had 7 towns. It became that school, not an individual school. I think that's what's so great here. They assimilate to Prospect Mountain. So I think that's why, if they come in, you give that opportunity.
And again, this is a sample admissions criteria, but I think this is going to hopefully foster some kids who are genuinely invested in their education.
I'm not getting anything.
Sorry, I'm speaking away from the mic. I would just say that this is an example.
Yep.
But I think this speaks to kids who are genuinely invested in their education. They're high thriving, they want to come somewhere where there's some options. Not necessarily someone who's just not happy with school. But again, if we open it up, we have rules that are going to be, they're going to adhere to everybody. They become a part of Prospect once they're here.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you all for attending. That's going to conclude our open enrollment hearing for this evening. And I'm going to close the hearing at this time. Thank you.